Hello, this is Fernando with Iron Age Audioworks. Today I'm going to show you how to replace the electrolytic capacitors on a 1280 Sound Workshop console. It's not that big a deal, it's just a lot of work removing knobs and removing the cards from within the console, but when you get down to it, it's pretty simple, so let's get to it. Alright, so after you've taken the bottom cover off, before you start poking around, a couple of warnings here. Please make sure that you've turned your unit off and that your power cord is unplugged. There's two capacitors up here. There's two voltage rails, one at plus 26 and one at minus 26 volts. And you see these capacitors say 35 volts on them. Those will maintain their charge even if the unit has been unplugged. So one of the things that we do, or you can do to discharge these, is you can actually measure the voltage on them with a voltmeter. Right now, there's about 4 volts on this, and on this guy, there's about 2 volts. So you can see it's discharging. Or another thing you can do is you get a common LED, and you can touch both leads, and you'll see the LED light up real quickly. You see how it lit up, and it let go of some of its charge. And now we can see that those capacitors have been discharged. Caution with the LED: if you reverse the polarity on the leads and you touch the negative lead of the LED on the positive side of that capacitor, you'll probably burn the LED. So just be careful with that. Okay, now we gotta remove the two main rails that connect every single card. So there are these clips. These units, they've been around for a while, so some of the plastic has become brittle. So just be very, very careful when removing them. They'll come off pretty easily. Sometimes they feel like they're a little stuck because maybe the plastic just has that feeling like it's been glued to one another. But it's just be gentle and pull them out. So now we have these rails come off. Okay, so now we get to take a look at the console from behind. You get to see the faders. All of the faders are here on the left side. Then we have the control room card on the very top, and then we have 12 cards that are almost identical. Some of them have some minor differences because some of the plugs in the back have different functions. But for the most part, the PCB is identical. And we're going to go ahead and remove one of these cards, and we're going to show you how to replace the capacitors. I'm also going to be doing some work with some of these slide potentiometers or faders, and I'll show you how to remove those. Alright, so when you look at the layout here, the first 8 channels on this 1280B have a super EQ, and the EQ knobs have a different set of potentiometers than the ones on channels 9 through 12. So I'm going to show you how to remove channel 8, being one of the more difficult ones because they have that special those special switches or with knobs on them. So there's another video I made about this a long time ago. It doesn't have any real, I guess, in-depth description, but you can see here it's easy to remove the little plastic caps with a knife carefully, and you'll expose the actual fastener that's holding these knobs down. There's a little collet here. The collet in there has a flat, and on the top one you can get to it with a regular flathead screwdriver. If the flathead screwdriver doesn't work, so remove the knobs. Then for the bottom knob, you have to make a special tool. Basically what I did is I took an angle grinder and I cut a slot in the middle of a regular flathead screwdriver, and that way you can reach below the stem into the collet that is tightening the bottom knob. The rest of the knobs you can take care of with an Allen wrench or with a Phillips screwdriver. The set screws, the tiny set screws on the knobs, it's a 50 thousandths Allen wrench. You can fit in there. Just make sure you don't scratch the surface of the console with the end of your Allen wrench. Maybe less than a quarter of a turn, and you would have liberated that set screw enough to where the knob just comes off. Okay, all the knobs are gone. The knob on the slide potentiometer. So now we have 3 screws and a set of nuts that are holding those potentiometers in place. Remove the screws. These 2 screws at either end of the slide potentiometer are not really holding the card in place. They're just holding the fader itself, but I'm going to remove it anyways because I'm going to remove that fader. I'm working on finding a replacement potentiometer for the faders on this console. So remove the 2 screws, and now all we have left is the nuts. And now there's nothing holding that PCB, and as a matter of fact, that PCB just kind of fell down into the board, so next time probably should be a little more careful and hold it. But anyhow, it's fine. I'm going to show you what it looks like from the back now. Alright, so like I told you before, the 2 screws held in the slide potentiometer, and then the rest is it's free to move. The PCB is free to move. There are some connectors here that once again might be a little hard since these things have been sitting here for a long time and that plastic's become a little brittle. But you can just gently pull the connectors off and the card should come out. The wire harness gets tangled in there sometimes, but you just free it up and it'll come out. So here you have, this is channel 8 with the Super EQ section, and behind on the console you have the wire harness. The potentiometer won't come off. You have to desolder it. I'm going to desolder it in a little bit, and then yep, just be careful that things don't get tangled in there while you pull. If you pull and the board doesn't come off freely, it's probably being held back by something else. So just keep that in mind. When you pull the board out, you'll see that there are some pots that are mounted on the PCB itself. Those don't have compression rings, but there's three pots that have compression rings here, and so that you don't lose them, just take them off now, and then it's a little tricky when you put it back in, but now that we're going to be handling this card outside of the console, it's better to keep all the loose parts out of it so that we don't lose them. If you look in the comment section of the video, you'll see a link to our website where we have basically the bill of materials for what you need to replace the electrolytic capacitors on one of these boards. We're going to be using some 220 microfarad and some 200 and 100 microfarad capacitors. And now we'll go step by step into removing and then placing the new capacitors on the board. Alright, so here we have a board with a Super EQ section on there, so you can't necessarily see the entire main PCB. There's 2 more screws here on the bottom that you need to unscrew and remove. And once those screws are removed, you can actually see that there's one capacitor down here that we need to get into. Make sure you work on a well-ventilated area. Some of the fumes from the solder does contain lead, so you don't necessarily want to be breathing in those fumes. I have an extraction system, and it puts out the fumes out through a carbon filter and then out through an exhaust. So that's the best way to do it. You know, otherwise you don't have something like that work near a window and a fan blowing the fumes away from you. All right, so we're getting ready to remove a capacitor. I'm going to be using a conventional soldering iron and a solder sucker, nothing really fancy. And you can see here we're going to start removing this one capacitor. The nice thing on the PCB here is the fact that they've put a plus sign on the, and you know that there's a capacitor back there. So you see, just heat up. What I do is I heat up the solder, and then once it puddles, I just suck it off, and for the most part, all of the solder comes out straight up. And then sometimes heating the lead and using the soldering iron to push. Let's do another one. This guy here is a radial. I'm going to heat up the solder and suck, and basically just I was able to heat both leads up, and the capacitor just fell off. Okay, let's go ahead and do this guy. The capacitor goes from there to there. So I'm going to heat up. You can see the rosin boiling. Be very careful, because sometimes these traces on this PCB will lift. Is removed. There are two capacitors on this board that are on a large copper pad, and those require extra, it soaks up a lot of heat, so it requires extra dwell time heating up your solder and before you can suck it up with the solder sucker. So just be patient with these. You might have to go in and make sure you heat everything up a couple of times before it all comes out. And it may not entirely come out. That black burning stuff, it's the rosin, so don't worry too much about it. We can clean that afterwards before we solder in the new ones. But the idea here is to make sure that you can solder you can suck all the solder out and then free these little leads.
So you can remove the capacitor.
Okay, now when you're installing electrolytic capacitors, they do have polarity. You have to make sure that you put the negative side of the capacitor with the negative side of the connection in the PCB. So you see here, there's a dimple or a little groove. That's usually the positive side, and then there's arrows saying negative this way. So this is the negative lead. This is the other side is the positive lead. And if you remember back down here on the PCB, some locations have a plus sign. I like to orient the capacitors to where you can actually read their values once they're on the PCB. So if you removed all of the solder, then you can just simply insert the leads down in their hole. If the solder was not completely removed, this is a good time to do it. Otherwise, by pushing, you might be actually pushing onto the trace, and the trace may come off on some of these fragile PCBs. I'm going to try again with the solder sucker. If the solder sucker doesn't work, another thing you can try is to use solder wick, and it's basically just a little braid, copper braid, and you would heat it up over the section, and by capillary action the solder just gets embedded into the wick and gets removed. So now I can see that in that location I don't have any more solder, and now I should be able to place the capacitor back on its position. The capacitors we're installing are a little higher value than was there before, so you might have to bend the leads a little bit to make them fit. Okay, now we're back to the soldering. Just apply a little bit of heat. I usually count 2 seconds, and then I start feeding in my solder, and the capillary action will just pull it in through that little hole, and it'll give you a good connection. One down. Now we're going to do the radial capacitor. Is also a 100 microfarad capacitor, but just like the other ones, but for whatever reason they just decided to mount this one radially, and it goes into these 2 little holes. Once again, polarity matters, and in this capacitor, or in many components, the longer lead is the positive lead, and then you can also see here that there's a line with negative signs, and that is right next to the shorter lead, meaning that is the negative lead. So this is the spot where it goes. Obviously on the other side you can see they put a plus sign onto the board. You can also see the pictures on the link, following the link for a reference, and just goes in there. You can confirm on the other side, the longer leg is in fact on the next to the plus sign, and it just heat up 2 seconds and feed. And that's it. Pretty simple. The next one we're going to put in is another 220 microfarad. Remember the polarity. You get the arrows pointing to who the negative side is, and they'll go through these holes. And like I told you before, since we're using capacitors with higher value than before, you just have to encourage them a little bit, since the footprint is not exactly the same. And this should be pretty good. And then feed. Oh, perfect. So you see here, this is what I was warning you about. You see how that trace lifted. These PCBs are not made like the ones that you get made today, where, well, just the fact that they're 40 years old, they're just a little more fragile. So when I put that lead for that capacitor through that hole, that trace lifted up. So you got to be really, really careful, because you might even, if you're not careful, you might break that, and you might not know it, and then you won't have a good connection. So just be really careful when you're threading the leads of the capacitors through their holes, and make sure that the traces don't get pulled up like that. So now the trace is back in its place. That section of the trace won't be permanently attached to the PCB, but the connection will be made to the capacitor, and that's what we need. So there's no way to reattach or glue that piece of trace down to the PCB, so you got to be really careful. And that takes care of all the capacitors on this board. Now that all the capacitors have been replaced, I have to install the screws that hold the Super EQ back on here. Okay, so we just installed new capacitors on this board. You're going to put it back in. Before you attempt to put it in, just want to caution you about these 3 small LEDs here. They go in 3 little tiny holes in there, and if they bend or they were pushed in from before, this is a good opportunity to push them back out and make sure they're evenly spaced above each one of their respective positions. We had 3 compression washers that came out of the loose pots. I put those back in there. And basically what I like to do is get the wire harness out of the way. Hold it up against something, and then you can see the wire harness for the next board is also there in front of you. Just push that down out of the way, and you just match the positions. Make sure that these pots that are not mounted on the PCB are relatively close to where they need to go, and without losing those compression washers, push everything in. It should go fairly smoothly, and you can see that threaded every single component through their hole. Now we're going to see what it looks like on the other side and put some of the fasteners on there so that the card doesn't come back out. I like to start by putting the nuts for the pots that are not sitting on top of the PCB so that they don't back out on me. So I'm pushing with my right hand, I'm pushing into the console, and I'm just tightening these nuts by hand. And once those are in place, now go ahead and start installing the ones in the other pots. Now the card is pretty much secure, and it won't fall off. Now we can reconnect the wire harness. It's pretty easy to go where each one of the connectors is supposed to attach to. And it's essentially ready. I need to install that slide potentiometer that I'm working on a different project on, but basically this card is been recapped and it's back in now. Okay, so I installed the slide potentiometer back on its position, and now that everything's in place, we can go ahead and tighten all the nuts. Alright, so I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any questions, please email us or make comments down in the comment section of the video, and like to know what you guys think. Thanks.